Welcome to the Voice Reclaim podcast, where we share stories that often go unheard and unexplained. Today, we'll explore Indigenous womanhood, a topic that embodies resilience, strength, and beauty, but often is seen through a colonial lens. This episode, Reclaiming Stories, is an invitation to set aside the stereotypes and step into the diverse realities of Indigenous women's lives. The purpose of this podcast is to educate, empower, and even inspire action. By the end of this podcast, hopefully you challenge your own assumptions and can maybe even be inspired. This episode is for everyone, from allies and community members to anyone who might not realize how much they have absorbed culture stereotypes. This podcast challenges you to see Indigenous women through a different lens. So, what does it mean to restore Indigenous womanhood? Well, in simple terms, it's about Indigenous women taking back control of narrative that often has been told through the lens of colonialism and patriarchy. Take a step back and think about it. Often, these mainstream media portrayals are often lacking of depth and understanding and work to depict Indigenous women through a colonial lens. But restoring goes further. It's not about telling a better story, but also challenging the lens through which these stories are told. There are a lot of Indigenous authors, artists, and activists that are actively creating spaces where their voices and stories can be heard authentically. That's a big word, authentically. It's a challenge to harmful stereotypes and reclaiming of identity, of Indigenous identity. This process, much like rethinking our media and food choices, encourages us to question and be conscious of the narratives that we accept. To understand Indigenous womanhood, we must first recognize the historical forces that attempted to erase it. In Bodies Studies in Canada, edited by Valerie Zawalowski, 2021, the reading describes how colonialism's success depended on the systematic defranchisement and erasure of Indigenous women. Colonial tactics often aimed to remove Indigenous women from their leadership roles, using forceful means to destabilize their communities. This erasure, in fact, is an attempt to silence their voices. Despite these efforts, Indigenous women have shown incredible resilience and strength. Scholar Diane Millen, as highlighted by Murthy in her article, discusses how colonial power structures are often referred to as master's gaze, refusing the genuine recognition of Indigenous people as equals. For Millen, drawn from thinkers like Frantz Fanon and Indigenous scholar Glenn Cawthorne, change means creating opportunities outside this colonial framework where Indigenous women can often define their own roles on their own terms. And doing my research for this assignment, I came across this thing called the ACHORD project, an Indigenous-centered arts performance Murphy describes as a transformative space for Indigenous women in Canada. This project allowed them to explore and represent their voices in ways that subvert this colonial expectation of Indigenous people. Although some critiques may argue that this project garnered roles reinforced stereotypes, but Judith Butler's theory on power and agency reminds us that true empowerment belongs to those who live these experiences. Here, Indigenous women took control of how they were seen and heard, stepping beyond this colonial gaze to create empowerment and self-determined identities. Building on this, Indigenous scholar Hayami K. Trask's insights into whiteness offers essential context for understanding the challenges Indigenous women face. Trask's review of talking up through capitalism, government, and education, particularly in colonial and capitalist nations, shows how this invisibility imposed onto Indigenous people normalizes the occupation of their lands by white settlers, erasing histories of violence and dispossession. Understanding this erasure is crucial to understand how Indigenous women's voices have always been sidelined and underscores the need for this restoring. Doing research for this project, I had to take a step back and question myself and how much my perception of Indigenous women has been influenced by these colonial portrayals. So I ask you to question yourself and take a step back and question the stories that you're missing. Our perception is shaped by the media that we consume, books, film, and maybe social media posts. For too long, Indigenous women have been boxed into this narrow, often dehumanizing role. This episode is an invitation to challenge that. Indigenous women's role within their community is often very vital and crucial to the community's survival. And to that question, are we ready to recognize and honor that? As we move on to our last segment, we believe that awareness is not only the beginning, but here's our call to action for you. Seek out Indigenous voices in the media, literature, and everything that you consume, and work to engage with their stories and share them to other people. Start to recognize how these narratives have often been shaped by colonial powers, and how now with the power of social media and all these technologies, how we can amplify these voices that have often been ignored. I want to thank all of you for joining us on this journey. Indigenous womanhood is very vast, resilient, and often layered in stereotypes. We owe it to these women and ourselves to listen, learn, and stand alongside them as we reclaim stories. Thank you for tuning in to The Voice Reclaimed. Remember that stories we tell and the ones that we amplify are what shape our world and everybody's understanding. So I want to call to everyone that's listening to make sure that the stories that honor truth and diversity are the ones that are told to our future generations. Thank you for listening, and for those interested, I've listed all the sources and references used within the episode within the description of this video. An outline of key ideas was initially drafted with the support of AI for structure and clarity, but was extensively edited to meet the assignment guidelines and maintain a natural conversational style. Thank you for listening to the podcast. My name's Abdisa, and I'm checking out.